All right, well, thank you very much for having us to the conference today and listening to some pathetic stories for a couple of minutes. So David, Buckley, Borden, and I are going to talk for the next little bit about our project, Hemlock Hospice. And Hemlock Hospice is a collaborative project involving landscape art, ecology, and design. And when we were asked yesterday to imagine ourselves in 2030 with what we think of as successful art-science collaborations, our response was, why wait? So we're going to talk to you about this today, and we're going to encourage you to come out and visit the exhibition at Harvard Forest sometime between now and the end of November when it closes. We'll start with a couple of introductions about ourselves in a little bit more detail that may help. So I'm Ellison. I'm a research ecologist at Harvard, working at the Harvard Forest. How many of you knew that Harvard had a forest? All right, that's pretty good. Usually we get no hands at all. So for those of you who don't know where Harvard Forest is, it's in the middle of Massachusetts, in central Massachusetts, at the northeast corner of the Quabbin Reservoir. Come visit us. I've been there almost 20 years, and the 30-second version is that I study how ecosystems, ecological systems are organized, how they fall apart with whatever perturbations affect them, whether they're so-called natural perturbations like earthquakes or fire or landslides or things like that, tree falls, insects, or human-caused perturbations like climate change, fire, earthquakes. There's a lot of similarity there. And then I study how they reorganize themselves and put themselves back together again. And I study this in a wide variety of systems. I study it inside of carnivorous plants. I study it in forests. I study it in computers. We use things like chaos theory and tipping point theory to do that sort of thing. And I'll work in sort of any system that I can to look at that. And today we're going to be talking a lot about hemlock forests, and I'll tell you a little bit more about hemlock forests in just a few minutes.
So I'm David. I'm a Cambridge-based
You got a mic, you can walk. All right, you walk, I'll walk.
See, we're comfortable on the fly. So I'm a Cambridge-based interdisciplinary artist and designer, and the focus of my practice for the last 5 or 6 years has been really developing a combination of art and design in service of environmental education. So sometimes I describe what I do as art in that it involves an expression, often a critique. Sometimes I describe what I do as design and that it's enforced by design thinking. Sometimes I describe what I do as a really ambitious communication project, but I always describe it as education. And I think this project supports that, and I think one of the reasons the project works on a number of levels is that Aaron and I have an allied interest in a shared vision of what both our own practices are, but also what we wanted to achieve with the project.
So, as I said, Harvard Forest is located out in Petersham, Massachusetts, in the middle part of the state, and we study the intersection between people and the environment, if you can separate them, through the lens of land use history and climate change as part of human land use and human land use change. And this is one of our dioramas at the Harvard Forest. We have a magnificent collection of dioramas built in the 1930s that you all must come to visit. I would say as an aside, we're the only Harvard unit that has free parking and free admission. So you can just come, the trails are open 24/7, and you just park and go. And they're great trail maps. The sort of context for this, Harvard Forest was set up in 1907 as a forestry school for Harvard University at a time when there was almost no forest in New England. All right, so this is a vision of what about Harvard Forest and what much of New England looked like from about 1850 to the early 1900s. And we were set up as a forestry school to help reforest this landscape, all right, because Europeans had come and they'd cut all the trees down. And in addition to studying the past and the present through the lens of land use history, we think about what the future might be and might hold for us. And so these are this is one example of a re-envisioning of what the New England landscape could be under possible scenarios of future land use, right? Could be intensive land use, could be expanded transportation. We could be trying to be completely self-sufficient with a lot of industry in Massachusetts. Or we could have another kind of future scenario where we're much more reliant on what we call alternative energy now, where we're more focused on conservation, where there's a different mix of trees and landscape. And those two dioramas David did, those two visualizations of future dioramas David did during his year in residence at the Harvard Forest.
So people often ask how we got together. So how did the collaboration start? And in many respects, it was happenstance or chance, or perhaps a shared interest. So one of Aaron's postdocs went to a show that I was exhibiting at the Innovation Design Building in Boston, Seaport area. And this was the show, well, one image from the show. And the show was really looking at woodland ecology through a pop art lens. So I was kind of pushing back on the doom and gloom approach to environmental messaging. And I said, what if we can develop a show that's about woodland ecology and celebrates it, and it's fun. So the idea is we use kind of visual language from essentially recreation culture. So canoe rides, Hudson Bay blankets, archery targets. But we talk about some of both the challenges and some of the things that are worth celebrating about the Adirondacks in particular. So, you know, some of the signs and whatnot address pressing crises, such as insect outbreaks, and some of them are just a more playful approach to, for example, communicating the ecological services of a shade tree. And this type of attitude, I think, is within the Hemlock Hospice project. We've definitely dialed the humor back, but the idea is that the project is really intended for an intergenerational audience, and that it's accessible art and design, and that it operates on a number of levels. This is my class's example of I guess, of my little acid test for the audience. I mean, what do folks see when they see this image? I mean, what do you think? What kind of pops in your head?
Woodpecker holes.
It's pretty good. That's great.
Anyone see anything else?
It's a family.
A family of woodpeckers?
Or target practice.
Or target practice.
Oh, maple juice harvesting.
Maple syrup harvesting.
Yeah, syrup.
A tree that is damaged, maybe?
A tree that is damaged.
It's a mixed forest.
It's a
Lots of
mixed
different kinds of
forest.
trees.
And there are lots of different kinds of trees in this picture.
And you could also say that all these responses are driven or informed by your past experiences, whether it's an educational experience or whether it's an informative experience you had in the woods of New England. You could see this and say, oh, that's an eyesore. That needs to be cut down. We need to chip it, get it out. Or you could say that's a really valuable input to this ecosystem. And the traditional model in science communication would look something like this. Interesting in so much that it's a little confusing. I love it and hate it at the same time as a designer. But I think we can do better than that. I think in order to really reach people, you need to have a cultural hook or some sort of something that kind of works on a number of levels besides just the science, if that makes any sense. And this is the example of my response to this is this. So it's a snack stand, and again, it's kind of capturing the same idea, in that the tree is an input for both habitat and food for both insects and the pileated woodpecker. In accessible art and design, often people think it's simplified or simple design. I often say that actually good accessible art and design operates on a number of levels. So if my 7-year-old nephew can get it and my 72-year-old mom can get it, that to me is accessible design, not something that's dumbed down. And it's a slippery slope, but that's the web we weave. And now it's going to talk about the big problem.
the big problem. So how many of you know about eastern hemlock trees and the hemlock woolly adelgid? All right, so we have a handful of you who have the background and the context. For the rest of you, I'll give a short précis here. So eastern hemlock is a late successional conifer. It's not really the Christmas tree, the balsam fir Christmas tree, but it's related. It's in the pine family. And it ranges from Georgia in the southern Appalachians up through Canada in the northeast and across to Michigan. And about 60 years ago, this insect, the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is about, as everything is, the size of a poppy seed, or it's the size of
The eye on George Washington's head and a quarter.
right? So that's another context, or is that, because if you, how many of us know what poppy seeds are anymore, right? On the needles of the trees, it forms these little white masses. It's related to mealybugs and scale insects, so it looks a lot like them. And it sits there and it pushes its little stylet type mouth into the vessels of the tree. It sucks all the juices out and it kills it. And this insect is not native to North America. It's native to North and East Asia, and it was introduced to the United States in the 1950s inadvertently on nursery stock coming into Richmond, Virginia, on a potted plant that someone wanted to buy and sell. And so it's been slowly moving throughout the range of hemlock and killing them all. And so in this part of the world, it really got in the 1980s, 1990s, and has been killing things slowly. But in the South, the Shenandoahs, the Smoky Mountains, all the hemlock's gone. It's all disappeared, just like chestnut went and elm went, things like that. So at Harvard Forest, we study this process. There are others who are working slowly and not very effectively to try and control it, either with pesticides or with biological control, none of which has yet proven very effective. And so as scientists, we study this, and the Hemlock Hospice project is aimed at trying to communicate both what we study, how we study it, and how we think about ecosystems that are changing rapidly, and how we relate to that empathetically and emotively as well as scientifically. At one level, the Hemlock Hospice installation is a new interpretive trail that tells a narrative story about the introduction of the adelgid and the decline of eastern hemlock and what's coming next and how this has changed our way of thinking. And so if you come out to Harvard Forest, 17 on Route 2, and you park here, free parking, and you grab a trail map, it's a 1 mile in, 1 mile back out interpretive trail with 18 pieces, 18 sculptural pieces. Wow, what happened with that? That was very interesting. No, I probably did. There we go. I got it. It's just my playing with the mouse. And so at one level, it's 18 sculptural pieces arrayed along this trail that tell a story. At another level, it's designed to get people thinking about how they think about the forest and their interaction to the forest. We rooted this initially along a trail that has long been used by researchers and by members of the community who come and enjoy the forest all the time. And the first piece, this wayfinding barrier, is right at where people would turn to normally go into the hemlock forest. And people come and walk their dogs and ride their horses and visit the forest all the time. And all of a sudden they can't go into the forest where they used to go into because the trees are all dead and they're an insurance hazard. We don't want them falling on people's head. And so the first piece, this wayfinding barrier, pulls people up short and says, look at the forest differently, right? You've got to go, there's a detour here to get you thinking differently. At another level, it tells stories about the insect and about how insects come into the forest. At the wayfinding barrier level, this is right about your place at Harvard Forest and how you see Harvard Forest. The insect is a slightly larger context. We have lots of non-native species. We have lots of native species whose biology is in outbreak and changing our forests. And this is a much more regional problem. And this is all part of a global problem, right? This is a part of a global problem in the climate change and ongoing climate change that non-native insects, outbreaking native insects, changing forest dynamics are all part of. So this ranges conceptually from things that are going on at the very local level, at the site-specific level at Harvard Forest, to things that are going on at larger scales on the planet. And it's also about community, right? And it's also about education. We'll come back to this, and about ways of seeing the forest in different ways. This particular piece at the entrance area to the exhibition, where we ask people to sign in, we encourage people to put hard hats on. Scientists wear hard hats when we're in the forest. It gets you looking at the forest in different ways. It also emphasizes the collaborative nature of this project. We had many other collaborating artists working with us on aesthetic design and collaborative design, and everyone who participated got to design their own hard hat, right, as their contribution, their direct contribution and their lasting sort of unique memory of the project.
So this is how I used to view kind of science communication-based collaboration. I know it's a mouthful. So I think of art as the tip of the spear. So art was the cultural edge to engage folks. I'm sorry, I'm not hitting this quite right. It was informed by design thinking, so being really mindful of what the goals were, what the framework was, what are the constraints, and really built on a foundation of science or research. And again, in the beginning of my practice, the research was all secondary research. I'd essentially just kind of follow my interest. But in time, I realized this was a really limited view of what interdisciplinary design could be for a science communication project. It actually looks something more like this, in that it's built on a foundation of what I call practical creativity. So it involves publicity, actually getting the project out of the forest and into the media, whether it's social media or traditional media. Program. So program is kind of the big, I guess, secret sauce to a project like this, both in terms of education as well as just kind of an experience for the community. Empathy, this is something that the scientists were really interested in exploring. And Aaron's going to kind of get into that a bit. And then the foundation of the whole thing, in my opinion, is community. And so we're going to talk today about three of these items: science or data, and/or data rather, empathy, and then community. So let's start with community. So what do people think when they hear the word community, just as a response? I can guarantee you're all thinking something slightly different. I feel like community means many different things to many different people.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first thing that came to my mind was my community, and then our community, and then their community, so I was thinking of it as different.
That's
Pieces and
a
parts.
brilliant response. You must be engaged in community-based art. I applaud. So there are a number of levels to the community at Harvard Forest. One, there is the community of the Harvard Forest researchers that live and work on site. Two, there's the community of researchers that come in from all over the world to use the long-term ecological resource, or the long-term ecological research resources. There's also a visiting community. So this student group from Rhode Island School of Design is a good example, but the visitors come in all sorts of walks of life, so to speak. So there's the kind of the community that we know of, and then there's the community we want to attract. So we're looking to build the community as part of the process. Next slide. And so I'm going to walk, yes.
How about the non-human community?
We'll get there. It's part of it.
We will get
too.
there. So I'm going to walk through a couple of pieces and just kind of talk about how they relate to community. And I think the biggest for me as a kind of creative is looking at the community as really the person who's driving the narrative. So the whole project, I'm not making the project for me as an artist or a designer. Really, I'm developing the project or collaborating on the project for the Harvard Forest and frankly, their agenda or their mission. So every time we kind of made a piece, we always check and make sure that it was in line with the narrative in which the Harvard Forest wanted to tell. And I think that was incredibly important, and actually it made for a really unique project that, again, I would not have been able to create on my own. The community is content drivers, so they're not just kind of setting the tone for the story, but they're actually, in many respects, providing a lot of the nuanced cultural detail. So you could have made a warning sign, countless approaches to it, and this is kind of a term they throw around, the widowmaker or the widower maker. And again, I would never come up with this on my own. It's really the Harvard Forest communities, their ideas, and kind of gathering them, analyzing them, filtering them, and then kind of representing them. And as you know, I was formerly trained as a landscape architect. I practiced in corporate design for about 3 years before I made a professional pivot to this type of work. So I have an obsession with material culture, or just the material of the landscape. And this is a great entry point into working with communities, really understanding the landscape in which they operate. And this is kind of, they're in a very classic, what I would call a New England vernacular. They have the stone walls, wonderful forests, open fields, sugar shacks. It's almost cliche. But on another level, it's a working landscape. So the Harvard Forest, it's 4,000 acres, and they have to maintain that property. They also harvest all the lumber for their own capital improvements, and then they even heat their facilities. I think about 60% of their facilities are heated with a state-of-the-art biofuel furnace that runs on harvested wood from the site. And then there's the material culture of the research community. So, you know, Harvard Forest is dubbed the Wired Woods for very good reason. There are literally hundreds of experiments going on at any one time, and this is just kind of a sampling of the material that you'd find in the woods as a reflection of their research. And then there's a subset, and this is kind of my favorite material, I guess, what would you call this? Eco-debris, eco-trash is what they call it. You know, it's basically all the leftover or decommissioned field experiment equipment. And, you know, the Harvard Forest is essentially run by a bunch of very thrifty Yankees, and they don't throw anything away. So they have what they call resource piles, such as this kind of supply of centrifugal fans that was used on a soil warming experiment, or warm ants experiment. And then this is just a sampling of the work from this fellowship. You can see there's a visual language to it. And again, it's directly drawn from the community and the place. I think it's a really original direction, and not that the creative direction is original. It's original in the sense that it's really rooted in place and culture of the Harvard Forest. And one of the reasons I think that really is worth mentioning is when you're kind of working with other communities, and in this particular case the science community, you and I might see a little funky wayfinding lamp or a study, but they're gonna look at it at a whole nother level. They're gonna see the heat lamp and they go, oh, that's what we used for that soil warming experiment 2 years ago. They're gonna see the ant nest boxes. Oh, that's what we used for, you know, XYZ ant experiment. Aaron's part of his work. They're gonna see the yellow paint, which is what they use on all to mark the trees on the mega plotter. They'll see the hemlock slabs as, oh, that's evidence of the harvest we did in 2016. And why I mention that is so, you know, you and I might see at first glance a lamp, but they actually use the artwork as a prompt to dig deeper into their work. So all of a sudden, when they're talking about the artwork with visiting communities, it allows them an entry point to talk about other research that isn't directly related to the project. So the Hemlock Hospice project was made from 90% either recycled or refurbished or reclaimed material found on site. And again, it kind of supports the ethos of the place, but also makes for a really unique, I think, visual identity. This is a great example of that. We could have painted this sign on anything, but painting it on this recycled buzzsaw from the sawmill operation adds a whole nother layer of meaning, kind of just makes it a little more interesting than if we painted it on a piece of plastic. So installation is community expression. So part of the project is really kind of providing a visual voice or a voice for the community and kind of working with them to communicate that with a visual form. Installation as program. So one of the big wins for the community is that they have basically what I would call an asset in which they can use or they can leverage to talk about their research on site, as well as draw new community to the site. Installation is interactive assets. So as a designer, I'm always interested in having pieces kind of function on a number of levels. Ideally, there's some sort of performative quality to it. So this piece is called the exchange tree. You can kind of see it kind of echoes a natural form we find in a dying hemlock forest. Essentially, the trees snap. There's enough life in the tree that the branches suspend the piece, and they kind of make this iconic form. And that I thought was a good start, but you know, as a designer, I'm always saying, well, that's cool, but that's not cool enough. So what we try to do is, for this piece, we made an interactive piece, and we invite folks to tie on forestry tape or flagging with messaging, with their sort of messages or responses or thoughts to the project. And of course, as scientists, they love data, and they're like, oh, that's an opportunity. We can collect some information about the project. Because they really see this, you know, as it's a science communication project that also has the ability to be a design impact study. So, you know, when I made the proposal initially to Aaron and David and the kind of leadership at the Harvard Forest, I think it's important to say that I didn't present it as an art project. I definitely didn't present it as a design project. It was presented as a science communication project, and I think that's really important to kind of underline.
And so this is the data that comes off, one piece of the data that comes off the exchange tree. And I would just add before I move into more of the data, that there's one thing missing from this word cloud, which is that about 30% of the ribbons, people just write their name. Right? We ask them to write a message and their thoughts, and most people just, 30% write their name. And so if we actually built the word cloud with, my name here, nothing else would be visible, because it's like this big and everything else is this big. And that sort of, you asked before about the non-human community in this. People come into this, and it really is, in a lot of ways, always about us, right? And so even when it's about the non-human community, it's still about us. And so I should actually put this in with the alternative word cloud with my name here. It's just it's not to me as interesting to look at, because I'm interested in that non-human community, and I'm interested in the overall data that we get out of this project, but I'm also interested in the data that we communicate out in novel ways about what's going on in the forest. And so I want to talk about a couple of the pieces that are really sort of data visualization in the forest. One of them is the double assault piece. This is the flip side of the saw blade that David showed a few minutes ago. It's painted on silk screened on both sides, showing that the trees are being killed by the Adelgid. But this one illustrates that trees are also being killed by climate change, right? And so and illustrates a few things about the project. First, there's a common color gradient, common color theme that we use throughout the project. It was cool and now it's hot. This is actually the global mean. Something fell. This is actually the global mean temperature trace from 1880 to the present. So it was cool and now it's hot. And that's more distant to the tree. And the Adelgid has been migrating northward because it's getting warmer and because it can. It's limited otherwise by the winter temperature. And so as it moves forward, as the climate changes, the insect moves along with it. So this is not just about an insect at the Harvard Forest, this is about climate change as well, and these multiple interacting pressures on our forests. This is one of my favorite pieces, and this was actually inspired by the student that we had working with us on this project last summer, because we talk a lot about invasive species and non-native species in our forests. And when we say something is an invasive species, we are implicitly, the language we use implicitly confers agency on that species, like it wanted to invade, like it bought a plane ticket or a boat ticket to come to Richmond, Virginia, and then it showed up. This is in fact not the case. At the same time that we're prompting people to think about how the forest is changing, we're trying to encourage people to think about how we relate to the insects in this case that are the agent of this change, even though they're not really, they don't have any agency in their being an agent. And then for data geeks, because we're scientists, this hemlock tent looks like a hemlock needle, right? The two white stripes underneath are how you distinguish hemlock from other conifers in our forest. And finally, on the data side, it's got all the states that hemlock woolly adelgid is now known from, in the same way that those of us who go, say, backpacking along the Appalachian Trail might collect patches and sew them onto our denim jackets or our backpacks or our tents in a playful way. So we get data across in lots of different ways, as well as prompting people to think about what it means to be a non-native species. This is another data prompt. Without looking at the title on the side, what do you see here, right? It's a bird hole. Oh, you're still thinking about woodpeckers, aren't you? Anyone else? Well, it is a tree core, right? Because scientists, we get a lot of data out of trees by taking tree cores and aging them and counting the rings and measuring the ring widths to get at climate change impacts. It's a data stick, right? And so we're actually losing data. This is this big, right? We're actually losing the data that's provided by this as the hemlock woolly adelgid kills the trees. We built this again at the multiple levels. This is actually a piece out of a hemlock tree from the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, where the hemlocks were all destroyed by the hemlock woolly adelgid, and they cut all those trees down. And so we actually repurposed one of the cookies, one of the slices from one of those trees to use this. We will build these custom-wise if anyone's interested in having one. Talk to us after the talk. This is another data visualization. To me, this may be the real origin of this project. At a large level, this really shows the wired woods in the hemlock forest. We have two towers here that go up above the hemlock canopy that are measuring exchange of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the forest, so we can see how the uptake of carbon is changing as the forest declines. There are little sensors here that measure the flow of liquid, of water going up and down. There's a spool of wire that actually says the wired woods on it. We didn't coin that term. And the visualization here, our lifeline of a dying hemlock, this was from the establishment of an experiment that I set up 15 years ago now to study how these trees would respond to the insect once it got there. At that time, the insect hadn't gotten there yet. We went out and we pretended we were an insect killing a tree and leaving it standing in place. So we took chainsaws and we cut rings around the bark of hemlock trees, and then we watched the trees die, and then we watched how the forest would recover when that happens. And this is the trace of that actually happening. So you have a control tree in black and a girdle tree in red, and this is before you cut it, and then we cut it, and now there's this big difference between the control and the girdle tree, and over time, that red line redlines, right? And you watch this tree die in real time. And this is my experiment. I designed this, and I thought, well, it's a really interesting experiment, and all we have to do is girdle, I don't know, 4,000 trees, and we'll see what happens, which we did in 45 minutes. And so thinking about that, thinking about doing that as a scientist and what that means to a forest, to me is an important piece of this overall project, because we also need to think not just as dispassionate scientists who go into the woods and kill trees to study how trees grow, but we're actually working with non-human organisms and thinking about what this actually means to the organisms we work with, means to us who work with these organisms. Quite honestly, it's really weird to say, oh, I want to study this, I'm going to go kill 4,000 trees. And then I go out to my forest plots, every week, every month, whatever, for 15 years, and there are all these ghost trees standing there looking at me for the next, 15 years. And so one of our expressions of this is our hemlock shoes, our wooden shoes here, where we carved feet into a hemlock stump, and this was in part inspired by one of Flossie's comments about standing in the shoes of the trees. And so we did this, and we encourage people to think about what it actually means to be a tree. It's actually really pretty hard for us to think about what it would be to stand in one place for 300 or 400 years, to get all your food up through your feet and through your arms. And so and people will actually stand in this and look at the forest, and you can see all these different things about the forest. And they do this completely unprompted. There's not a sign there that says, oh, please step up in the shoes. People just walk right into them. There are other things that we think about when we're using the forest, that we try and get people thinking about, okay, how do you really relate to your forest? Lots of people going into the forest think of the forest as biofuel, right? It's a resource. We actually use the language natural resource to describe non-human organisms, right? It's a resource. It's a fishing resource. It's a tree resource. As soon as you dehumanize something that way, it's just for us to use. Lots of people just think of the forest as something to use. People think about it in other ways too. And it really is part of a much larger issue. It's not just the insect at the Harvard forest. This is a global issue here.
So I'm going to talk about challenges. Some of these have come up over the last day and a half. Some of these have not, and I'm excited to see how you respond to them. So I'm going to talk about it in the context of one particular piece that we call Fast Forward Futures. This piece actually draws attention to what is going to occur next in this dying forest, which is a successional landscape of black birch. So it really just draws the viewer's eye to a large, huge black birch thicket that's to the left. Just real quickly to unpack this in terms of visuals, it's a media player essentially, or abstraction of a media player symbol you might find on a DVD or an iPhone. It's also a bunch of interlocking deltas. So symbols for change, you see the color pattern is, again, borrowed from heat maps or global climate change maps. The first kind of big constraint is that this is a working forest. The Harvard Forest up to this point had never done a project of this nature or scope, and there was significant design constraints, which I, as kind of someone who's trained in design thinking, I was like, that's fine, just give me the list, give it to me early, don't change it. And one of the things was everything had to be low impact, so there was no guy wires, no foundations, no cement. So this piece is about 32 feet long, 12 feet wide, and it just has 7 contact points to the earth. Everything that we brought out had to fit in the back of a Tacoma pickup, so a lot of the pieces were designed in a modular fashion that we could install it in the woods, but at the same time we weren't making a construction site of the research forest. Everything had to be pre-approved, so there is a person that manages all this research plots on the Harvard Forest, and each site before it actually went in, or each piece before it went in, had to be kind of get Audrey's go ahead. This work was time intensive. This was a year-long fellowship. This is a great example. The piece initially started out as, well, maybe we can do a zigzag fence, kind of a classic New England zigzag fence, and just kind of frame the piece. We tested it in model. We liked it. We brought it into the field, and it sucked. It was just very underwhelming. That maybe is a good nice way to say it. It just totally got swallowed up by the forest, and then we just left it for a couple weeks. And then 2 months later, we ended up with the final piece. The resources, very popular theme for this week. The director of the Harvard Forest will tell you, I've heard it myself, I've seen it in writing, the Harvard Forest does not support open-ended art projects. This was not funded as an art project. In fact, there was a variety of funding sources. None of them have the word art or design next to them. So first and foremost, this was part of a Bullard Fellowship in Forest Research. So this project was just as much about as creating this work as it was exploring the kind of a new wave or a new approach to science communication. It was also funded through a science communication budget. It was also funded through an REU program, which is, I always forget what it stands for, but
Research experiences for undergraduates.
they love these acronyms. And it was also funded with a variety of what I would call slush funds, such as the Dean's Fund. And again, I don't think, why I mention all this is that just because someone doesn't have funding for the arts, I don't think that should stop you from developing a really convincing proposal and making the funding work however you can. Being creative, I guess, about the funding.
Just as an all-in number, we estimate the year budget was about $150,000 to pull this off.
And this is another one of the expenses. So there was a lot of outside fabricators that we brought in. So essentially we conceptualized the work, we'd figure it out in model in terms of the design or construction documents, and then we bring in outside folks to actually fabricate the work on site. And I've been accused of creating the first non-sanctioned artisan residency program at the Harvard Forest. But they got a kick out of it, we got a kick out of it, and but again, it couldn't have been possible without them. Different communication styles. So the scientists, they think in terms of mathematics most often, at least the scientists that I was working with on this particular project. They're an evidence-based practice. They're a show-me culture. It wasn't too soon after being that I realized they really responded to the study model, physical models in which they could hold, they could spin it, they could really kick the tires on it. So again, I think one of the keys to kind of a successful collaboration is finding a common language in which you can communicate. Different criteria for success. This, I think, is a big potential pitfall. Aaron and I, from the beginning, we were all on the same page in that this was a mission-driven project. We shared an agenda, we shared a value system, so there wasn't really a lot of questions on what we were doing. And anytime we did have a disagreement, we'd bring up, is this moving the agenda forward? If it wasn't, we would often just stop arguing about it. Well, if it's not, we shouldn't even be talking about it. There's plenty to work on than to kind of being caught in, what would you call that, debating shades of gray. So we would just move on often if we couldn't, if it didn't fit the success criteria. So the big outcome for the project, or the big product, I notice is a word that you guys like to use a lot, or I heard a lot this weekend, and I know the science community uses this word product. So the big product for this project is not the art, it's certainly not the design. The big product is all the opportunities in which the art creates in terms of education, outreach, and community engagement. So we're going to tag team on this one.
To finish up, we will talk about these opportunities and how we're moving forward with this. We talked about community, so we're not going to talk really anymore about community, but this has really brought a lot of people together at the Forest, and to sort of preempt the question, everyone at Harvard Forest is totally on board with this. The support we got from the scientists, the admin staff, the surrounding community was just incredible. You don't just put an installation in the middle of the woods 90 miles from Boston in a town that no one's ever heard about and expect people to come and show up, right? So there's publicity that you have to do, right? And our outreach manager at Harvard Forest was actually on maternity leave while we were working on this, and so we had to do this ourselves to do the PR and initial outreach effort. And we were pretty successful. This is our list of coverage to date, as it were, and what's been really interesting since the opening in October is we've actually had something come out in something regional or national about every 2 weeks in the last, what is now 6 months, which is really well beyond what I would have ever expected as a scientist. Most of these are art and design outlets. There are not very many straight mainline science outlets. And as we've reflected on this, we think that a lot of that has to do with who we know and who we can network with. So the networking is incredibly important, right? I know a handful of science journalists, but not very many. And David knows a lot more people in the design and art and architecture world that we were able to tap directly. Just sending out random press releases, it feels good, and you can press a lot of buttons, but the return is not as good as we would have hoped. Nonetheless, the coverage has been really great. This is from Landscape Architecture magazine, a month or two ago. For me anyway, the big coverage was in Orion magazine in this spring. We do field trips, right? People come and visit. We've actually set up Harvard Forest does lots of field trips. We do lots of guided tours of things at the forest. We've tacked on an extra one for Hemlock Hospice that David does, or one of our trained and educated tour guides does. People can sign up for those in advance. It costs money, as everything costs money. But it's a great opportunity for student groups, for individuals, for small groups, whatever. We also have self-guided tours. We've created a tour guide, a brochure about the project. You can come, you can pick that up, you can walk and enjoy it on your own. And so this reaches a variety of different audiences who either like guided tours or don't like guided tours, or prefer walking on their own for whatever reason. It's also data. We do ask people to sign in, and we collect data on this so that we can say, are we doing more on visitation than, for example, the records that we keep for the museum or other student groups, or less, or about the same, so that we actually have a way to assess the impact of the project. We give talks about this. We started out again with networking, right? We call our buddies at the design schools, at the nearby colleges, and say, hey, you want to hear us talk about this? And most people say yes, and so so it started out at that level, and then we sort of have expanded through the publicity and the word of mouth, and so now we have a lecture tour schedule on this, and this is a great way to get the word out, and you just pound the pavement on this.
So, one of the challenges of getting folks to a remote location is that they often don't know about the project. They're living in an urban environment. And so we took a page out of the National Parks approach to developing gateway exhibitions or gateway displays to really draw people to a more remote location. So we're doing what we call satellite exhibitions. So this is 3 of them from the last 6 months. So we have a installation at Montserrat College, RISD, Rhode Island School of Design on the bottom, and the Urbano project. Our next one is at
Maine Audubon, coming up later this week.
That's right. And then again, this is a way to kind of give the project a little more reach, and it's really possible because the project has what a publicist would call a long tail. I've done a number of exhibitions, and I find that the longer you can make the exhibition, the more opportunities you have for press. That doesn't mean you just open it up and run the show. It typically means you open it up, you have a robust program in terms of getting attention. For a lot of the press comes from publicity folks. They like 3 things, to generalize. They like a good, relevant story, ideally related directly to their readers or local population. They like strong images, and they like events in which they can direct people to. So we kind of built that into the project from the beginning. And then we've continued to build the project. So given that it has a 14th month, 16th month life, we are developing a new installation to essentially close the project. These are the design studies for that. So this will be installed on the main campus in Cambridge. It's about, it is a mammoth piece. It's 32 feet long, if my memory serves me. And basically it kind of ties into the Harvard University community by engaging a variety of departments, including the Office of Sustainability, which is using this as a launch pad for their 2050 fossil-free initiative that they've just kicked off recently. All the photos and a lot of the, what I call creative assets, are online. These are there for anyone to use. Again, part of the educational intent. The Harvard Forest is really wonderful and effective at cataloging the information and making it available to the public on their archives. The project is also creative assets for others beyond that. So this is a print series that we're developing with a lab out of UMass who does LiDAR scanning, so they use lasers to study the structure of the forest. So again, we're taking their technology, their science, and bringing it in to the creative processes and developing silkscreen prints for exhibition. And merchandising. The wonderful thing about this project is we did not need to merchandise it in order to support the construction or promotion of the work. In many respects, the merchandising are just take-home promotional items. This is a valid model only if you have the infrastructure or retail, no retail, what do you call it? Retail wherewithal. I do not recommend kind of trying to fund a big ambitious project just on retail if you have no experience doing it. I've tried it. The big failure of the project, or the big missed opportunity, maybe is a nicer way to say it. One thing that this project does not have, which we are working to, or we plan to address in the next 6 months, is that there wasn't a direct action component. So kind of one of the big things I've been hearing over the weekend, what's the final product? To me, like, if the final product needs to be direct action, why are we doing it? It's just a vanity project if you're just kind of creating work for the sake of creating work. Again, I do that all the time, but that's not this project. So what we're doing now is working with a variety of partners from the university and developing a little, what you call a direct action campaign focused on the university, at the university, and again, kind of leveraging some of these creative assets we developed over the last 18 months. Because really what we want to do is, the big question is how can we use art and design and science in the form of science communication to inform behavior and cultural attitudes and ultimately drive a direct action towards a preferred landscape futures. And I think that's my big why on why I do this work, and I think Aaron's as well.
So we want to finish up with perhaps a question for all of us as we move forward. David started with showing the partie diagram of art and science and design and expanded that to include publicity, program, empathy, and community. But these kinds of practice mode diagrams, these partie diagrams, are always hierarchical, right? There's like community here and you have all this stuff and you end up with art. Or depending on what community you are, you put yourself on top, right? And one of the things I think that we really learned from this and that really makes for successful collaboration is that it's not hierarchical. It's not like that. And we don't really know how to represent that. We know that it's not upward hierarchical. And we also know that it's not unidirectional, right? But we don't really know what to do with that. And so we'll leave this with you as we know that this sucks. We just ran out of time. We don't know what to do better here. But we're looking at least for visual ways to illustrate better the art and science and creative collaboration, because both of them have a lot of creativity on them. And there are lots and lots of interacting pieces and parts here. It's not just artists, it's not just scientists, it's not just creativity. There's broader community, there's emotive responses, there's data, there's programming. You can't just talk to yourselves in a room, right? You gotta get it out there. And so we look to the rest of the world to help us figure this out. So thanks very much. Feel free to, as we were, follow us, talk to us, communicate with us. We're happy to come to you to talk about this more. If you want us to come to Houston or anywhere else, we'll be delighted to hop on a plane. So let's continue the conversation. Thank you very much.